Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amelia Shaw, and I'm the Executive Manager for IAP2 Canada and IAP2 USA. And today I will be your moderator for the learning webinar. It's with extreme pleasure that we welcome Miranda Eng to our learning webinar this morning. She's going to be speaking about Not Just Dragons, a model for engagement with communities of color. So we're excited to hear from Miranda. I know it resonates with many of our participants on the call today. But before we get going, I'd like to let you know that we are coming to you from East Souk, British Columbia, and we acknowledge with respect that it is on the ancestral land of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples on southern Vancouver Island, signatories to the Douglas Treaties of 1850. Their traditional connection with the land continues to this day. So I want to thank you for that, and I really want to thank you for joining us on behalf of IAP2 Canada, IAP2 USA, and IAP2 Australasia. So without further ado, because I know that Miranda has lots to share, and we're really actually hoping that all of you also participate. So we're going to get going, but just before we do that, Drew, any housekeeping items?
Got a few of them here. As Amelia said, we look forward to you taking part as well. So we've got a number of ways you can take part in this. One of them is through the polls, and Miranda's got a few poll questions for you. We've also got our question box. You can type your questions in there, and Amelia will break in at any particular time when it seems appropriate and ask the question for you. Or if you'd like to ask it verbally, there is that little hand icon. You click on that and we'll see that your hand is up, and we'll unmute your microphone and you can ask your question. About your microphones, please leave them all unmuted. We'll mute them on this end, and as I say, if you've got something you want to say, let us know. We'll open up the microphone at that stage. So we'll take care of the muting and unmuting here. This is being recorded, and so you'll be able to go back and refer to it at later dates to check out something. You might want to hear something again. There's a lot going to be packed into this, so you might not catch it all in the first go. And we'll also send you along Miranda's slide deck and any other collateral information that she's got to go along with this. You'll be able to have that as well. And we will send all of that out to you, including the link to the recording, which will be posted on YouTube. So we'll send you out that link within about 24 to 48 hours of this, and send that around to all of you. So with that, I think that's about all that I need to take care of. So Amelia, I will toss it back to you.
Excellent. Thanks very much. So Tracy, you asked about, will we get a recording of this webinar? And yes, you will. As Drew's just said, everyone will get a recording of the webinar within 24 to 48 hours after this has been completed. So thank you for your question, Tracy. And now it's with my pleasure that I get to introduce Miranda Eng. Miranda is a senior consultant at Context and Argyle Company, excuse me, the largest independent engagement firm in Canada. She has worked on high-profile engagement programs in public policy and infrastructure, including mobility pricing in Metro Vancouver and Calgary's potential bid for the 2026 Winter Games. She brings a unique lens and background from working in the federal public service, graduate studies in behavioral strategy, continuing studies in user experience design, and nonprofit work in racial equity. As a young woman of color, Miranda applies an intersectional lens to her work, aiming to hear from those who are hard to reach, yet disproportionately impacted by projects and policies. She serves as a board member of a Chinatown nonprofit working in community-based research, engagement, policy development, and leadership development among Asian identifying youth to advance social change. So with that, Miranda, I really want to welcome you to today's learning webinar. How you doing?
I'm good. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I hope I'm not muted. Everyone can hear me.
We sure can hear you, and we're looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that great introduction, Amelia and Drew. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time. I hear there are folks who are tuning in from Australasia at a very absurd time in the morning. So I really want to thank all of you for taking some time out of your busy days to tune into this conversation in this webinar today. I am personally really humbled that we can have this time and space to be able to talk about a topic like this. And I'm really grateful to IAP2 Canada for inviting me back to deliver this presentation after delivering it in Victoria last year. I think it speaks a lot to the humility and the interest in talking about race equity and race issues. So I'm really appreciative of that. So my name is Miranda Eng. I'm a senior consultant at Context, part of the Argyle Group. And I'm here today to share my experiences and my learnings from a pro bono project that I led about 2 years ago on inclusive engagement. And I am presenting to you from Vancouver, Canada. And it was where the study was conducted as well. And I just want to acknowledge that the presentation today is coming to you from the unceded and traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, including the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations. And this study was really meant to forward our role and our work as engagement professionals and working towards reconciliation and really working towards decolonizing our engagement practices. So as both Drew and Amelia said, we have a lot to get through today. I wanted to really pack it in. So a little bit of an overview of what we'll be talking about, a little bit about who Context is, who I am, and I'll talk about what we did, what we heard, and also importantly, what we can do as engagement professionals, and then give some time at the end about hopefully aiming for 15 minutes to go through some questions and have some points of discussion. As Drew said, the presentation will be circulated afterwards, so if I end up speaking really quickly and excitedly and nervously, know that the presentation will be available to you, and as well as some other materials. Also, just a heads up that some of the terms today may be new or unfamiliar or may be a bit vulnerability inducing. I just want to make sure that this is a safe space for us all to learn together. And so know that if you're familiar with a term, write it down, look it up afterwards, and know that there are a wealth of resources that you can refer to help you along that journey. So as I mentioned, my name is Miranda, and I really want to, webinars are a bit hard to get to know each other. So I want to take a little bit of time for us to do that, to get to know each other. And I also want to preface that what we'll be talking about today is really based on my experiences and my lens as a woman of color in a project that was set in Vancouver's Chinatown. And this is based on who I am, what I do, and my lived experiences. So based on the introduction, as you heard, you know that I wear two hats. So I'm an engagement professional, but I'm also a board member of a nonprofit in Chinatown and also the co-chair. So what we do is really in the race equity world. So we are looking for more representation among people in power and decision makers. And so we do that through research-based engagement and policy advocacy, and also through youth leadership development. And Context, who I work for, we're part of the broader Argyle company. So we are a national team with local knowledge and presence in cities across Canada. And we're known for our innovative engagement community and communication programs for projects that build healthy and sustainable communities. And we work primarily, our bread and butter is really on stuff that's a bit more technical in nature. So transportation, infrastructure planning, policy and program development. And as Amelia mentioned, we've worked on really high profile projects, from mobility pricing to the Calgary Olympics, and some more localized projects in there. And then as you see from the line here, when it comes to our role as engagement professionals, we like to refer to ourselves as a bit of a conduit. So we set a place for communities to sit at the table when important decisions are being made. And what's really interesting is that this other quote shows a bit of the intersection where I'm at. So describing ourselves in this way, there are a lot of metaphors about tables when it comes to engagement. It raises key questions that my executive director, Kevin, at the Hua Foundation, he often asks this when it comes to public engagement. So who are we not often hearing from? Who's at the table? Who's not at the table? And is the table in the right place? So this kind of intersectional perspective and this commitment to inclusive engagement, it's a grounding value that we have here at Context, who sponsored and funded this pro bono project that I'll be talking to you about today. Because as a company, we wanted to do this both out of a commitment for best practices, but also recognizing, pretty frankly, that our engagement frameworks and our processes, they're really failing to hear from those who are impacted and who are marginalized communities and communities of color. So again, as I said, webinars can be a bit sterile because, I mean, you don't see me, I don't see you, I don't know who's in the room. So I want to ask a couple questions to help me get to know a bit about you. So the first question here is, where do you live? So I'll toss it back to Drew.
Thanks so much, Miranda. So just quickly, if you could just let us know where you live. And we know that it's really early for Australia and New Zealand. So if you're with us, thank you very much. But let's hear from everybody else. Okay, Drew, I think everyone should have had a chance to respond. Let's see where we're at. So we have 54% from Canada, 45% from the United States, and we do have somebody from New Zealand, but unfortunately our Australian colleagues might still be in bed. So hopefully they'll hear the recording once it's done. All right, Miranda, back to you.
Thank you so much for joining, and big shout out to the person who joined us from New Zealand. Thank you. I love your country so much. Thanks for joining. And to our American neighbors, thank you so much for joining as well. So the second question that I have here is, do you identify as a person of color? And frankly, I know this is a tough question to ask, but I really want to go for it because I think it's important for those of you who are racialized with lived experiences for me to understand that you are in the room. And I just want to flag that some of the content that I will be talking about, it may be a bit triggering. So I just wanted to put that flag out there.
Thanks, Miranda. So hopefully everyone's had an opportunity to respond, and let's see the results. So 22% are yes, 78% are no.
Okay, great. Thank you for your honesty and your openness with me. I really appreciate it. That's it's, again, really hard in a webinar environment, so thank you for sharing that with me. The third question we have here is to make sure that we use our time wisely. So what do you want out of this presentation? So is it to A, understand the experiences that cultural communities face? Do you want to be more culturally competent? Do you want to learn some practical tactics? Or for those of you who did respond yes, do you want to feel seen and supported? Or maybe other, just let us know.
Excellent, Miranda. So the questions are up there. And as it says, please select all that apply, and I'll be watching the question box to see if there's any other. So please don't hesitate to pop it in the question box if you've got any other reasons for attending. All right, Drew, hopefully everyone has had an opportunity to respond. Let's see the results. So 48% to understand the experiences cultural communities face, 53% to be more culturally competent, 93% to learn practical tactics to apply for inclusive engagement, 8% to feel seen and supported, and we have a couple of others. Oh, A, B, and C, so a combination of all of them. So thank you very much for your responses. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a snapshot of who's in the room. And you have just over 100 people on the call with you today, Miranda. So a great wealth of experience. And I must admit, I hope that as today's webinar continues, people will jot down questions and thoughts that they might have so that we can have a really robust conversation as you bring this to a close. So back to you.
Thank you, Amelia. 100 people. I feel very honored. So thanks again for being here. And I'm glad that I asked that question 3. And throughout the presentation, hopefully some of you will better understand why I asked this and why the importance of A, better understanding some of the experiences cultural communities face, how that's so important to points B and C, how understanding these experiences is a crucial factor to becoming more culturally competent and learning practical tactics. Okay, so I also want to again preface that this presentation is based on my lens and my experiences and my learnings set in Vancouver, particularly with the Vancouver Chinatown Chinese Canadian community. And I say that because the Chinatown Chinese community, and some of you may have Chinatowns where you are, and some of you may be very familiar with the history. But I want to give a brief overview about Chinatowns. They were created as ethnic enclaves to segregate the first wave of Chinese immigrants to the US and Canada, and this this dated back to the late 1800s. And this was a combination of anti-Chinese and anti-immigrant sentiment, and really racist policies that prevented their assimilation and prevented them from job opportunities. And so these Chinatowns really provided a safe space for social and economic opportunities, and also kept them safe from anti-Chinese riots and violence. So the important part is distinguishing that this project is about a community. It's not just about a community who speaks a different language. So it's centered around a community that has a traumatic history. They've been around for a while. They're not newcomers. They have and they continue to be marginalized. And so understanding a bit of these characteristics about the community can help you see some similarities as they may relate to the communities that you engage. So fast forward many years, it was 2014, a couple years ago, where there was a lot of rapid development and gentrification in Vancouver's Chinatown. And 105 Kiefer popped up. So a developer applied to build a building in an empty parking lot, and they applied for this rezoning application to build a building that exceeded the height requirements of Chinatown. And so this parking lot was really in a culturally significant part of Chinatown, as it was located right next to the Chinese War Memorial and the Dr. Sun Yat-sen Gardens. And this brought really intense community opposition, and there were many revisions to the proposal, and eventually City Council and the city's Permit Development Board rejected the proposal. And what's really interesting is that this issue drew the highest participation at public hearings in Vancouver. So there were over 200 speakers and over 25 hours of speeches, which is more than a proposal for a downtown casino or even proposed bike lanes in an affluent area, which I'm sure all of you know is a bit of a pain point. And there were 4 years of consultation. There were so many community open houses, I think there were about 5. There were so many meetings with advisory and stakeholder groups. There were 4 separate public hearings that went into the wee hours of the night. And so what was interesting was you had the developer and the city's perspective where it seemed like there was adequate consultation. But to the community, there was significant media coverage and so many op-eds that were talking about the lack of meaningful public engagement. Many of them speaking on behalf of seniors and community members who felt like they were excluded from the process. And so when we talk about inclusion, we have to talk about exclusion. And as an engagement professional and someone involved with Chinatown, this project, this 105 Kiefer issue made me really curious. And this really drove the focal question that was the basis of the pro bono project that I led 2 years ago. And so the objectives of this project were twofold. So the first one was to educate ourselves. And the best way to do that is to go directly to the community. The second objective here was to be better. We want to understand how we can conduct meaningful, inclusive engagement. And so we wanted to have a guiding framework that came out of this work. And so the objective here was to co-create a new model for inclusive public participation and co-create this with the Vancouver Chinatown community so we could share this with our industry and fellow engagement professionals. And this is what I'll be presenting to you today. So the project was essentially 2 focus groups and a bit of a research study. So it started out as from conducting research, we found some best practices that were being done in the industry and that were written about, and we used these to create a skeleton model that we could populate with community input. We then conducted outreach to gather study participants. We then designed the focus group. We then hosted 2 focus groups with 21 very active and visible community members and leaders. We then brought together all the data and analyzed it and then drafted and developed the model. And then we had a report back meeting with a sushi dinner where we talked about what we heard. We presented our draft model for the community input and validation. Then we finalized it and we circulated to the community a final report. The pretty basic stuff. I mean, you all are very familiar with focus group projects. But what I really want to hone in on is these 2 pieces here that are in yellow. So the outreach and the focus group design. Because I can tell you, this was incredibly difficult, very personally challenging for me and just to get the ball rolling. So in terms of outreach, with my knowledge and connections within Chinatown and through referrals, I started reaching out individually and via email to invite people to participate. So these emails included a project overview, who I was, who I am, who Context is, our intentions. I even name dropped the executive director of the Hua Foundation, who is a respected community leader. But this email was not enough. I was met with an incredible amount of suspicion. And this is really to be expected on the heels of 105 Kiefer, when the community felt so tired and so worn, and they felt disrespected. And so they didn't trust us at Context. They didn't trust me. They wanted to know my intentions. So the initial outreach had been too generic. And so I fielded a lot of phone calls and follow-up emails and in-person meetings with community members who wanted to know more. So what I did was summarize the questions and the answers that I provide to everyone and sent it out, just very humbly saying, you know, I mismarked my first email, and this is really what the project is about and what we're trying to achieve. Sent it out to everyone, and again, kept on meeting with individuals. And over time, we hit a tipping point where we did get, 21 individuals who were interested, which was great. And this made the focus group design very difficult. I'm sure you can imagine, you want to respect everybody's time. And so what we did was we built quite an ambitious agenda. And over time, with our challenges with the outreach, we realized that we really needed to redo the design. We needed to make more time and give the community more space to feel heard. And so designing this was tricky. You wanted to balance building trust and earning trust with me and with Context. Secondly, you wanted to make space for the community to be heard and to feel heard. And you also wanted to stay focused on gathering the input into a productive model rather than ensuring that it was avoiding event fest about 105 Kiefer. And so we adjusted the agenda many, many times. And so I wanted to share a little bit about what it ended up looking like. So the first part was an introduction, and this was really to get to know one another. So really frank conversations where we had a very open and honest Q&A where we answered frankly, and there were very frank questions. And what was interesting was this ended up being about a third of a 2-hour focus group, about 45 minutes, just in that get to know you period. The second part was a plenary discussion where we wanted to understand how the community defined inclusive. So understanding what makes them feel included and excluded. And then the third part of the focus group was a breakout session where we had facilitated discussions looking at industry practices based on our initial research and gap analysis. And really wanted to understand what's working and what's not working and what's missing and how could this be executed. Okay, so I've gone through that pretty quickly. Again, some more details are in the report that we have on Context website. So what I'll do now is just dive into the model. So the model that we co-created is built on a foundational layer of grounding principles and a set of limitations. And there are also 5 pillars, each with guiding strategies. And so what was interesting in that plenary session when we talked about and we defined what inclusion looks like, there were a number of recurring and really strong themes that the community members really wanted to drive home. And so what we did was we wanted to put a spotlight on these themes because they really represent a paradigm shift in how we approach our work and principles that really should be explored and understood before we even engage with the community. And the first one is power. So the notion of power is that our experience and background gives us a certain worldview where it's hard to fully appreciate and understand what it's like for the communities we engage and we want to hear from, and what their barriers are and what their lived experiences are. The second principle here is cultural safety, and this actually was coined from New Zealand in Indigenous health. And so cultural safety is acknowledging that a community's worldview may be different from yours, and it's taking the time to learn and appreciate their lens and seeing it as equal to yours. And it helps you really ground that understanding based on understanding and grasping the history. The third principle here is investment. So it's really moving away from a one and done approach and moving towards a principle and approach that really takes the time to earn community trust and build understanding of the project among the community. And I'm sure for those of you who work a lot in Indigenous engagement, a lot of these principles will really resonate with you and the work that you do. It was also really important to be really transparent about what the model is and what it isn't. So our model has a number of, it's a work in progress. It was only with 21 individuals. They are active and visible. However, the focus group is only conducted in English. So it definitely is not the most representative. It was restricted in language. As I mentioned, it is a work in progress, and it's not prioritized by any means and should not be used as a cookie cutter approach across all communities. So we just wanted to make sure that while we do share it, that everyone is aware about that it's not the be all and end all, but it really is a starting point. So the model, as I mentioned before, has 5 pillars, and each pillar is structured with a goal. So what are we, as the engagement team, what are we trying to achieve when we're engaging the community? And the outcome, how would this look and feel for community members? And then the important part, so the practical tactics, how do we get there? So under the guiding strategies, we have a number of tactics, and these are posed as guiding questions because we really wanted to make sure that this didn't become a checklist, that you do this and this and this, tick, 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 and then you have now achieved cultural respect. No, that's not what we were aiming for. So we wanted to make sure that this was a guide, but definitely not a checklist. Okay, so moving to the first pillar. Equity. It was interesting because throughout the focus group process, equity was not one of the proposed pillars that we had in our skeleton model. And this really came out from the community that this should be its own pillar. And people felt particularly that they had no power and that they had no say about what happens in their community, especially for those who have more to lose, such as lower income seniors who can't speak English. Who aren't involved or who aren't heard in processes. So our goal here is to design an engagement process that reaches and amplifies marginalized voices so that community members feel like they're being heard and treated fairly. And so what can we do here? Design a process to balance power dynamics. So much like the experience we had in designing the focus group, it's designing workshops and events where you listen more and you talk less, so giving more space to community members. It's also like this quote on the right talks about, think about designing tactics where you let community members do their own note-taking, as you can often lose the nuance or the meaning when we record it from our own lens. And potentially that could include including quotes in your reports, which is a really good tactic. Second point here is ensuring that you're hearing from those who aren't often heard. So what's interesting is there's not just a power dynamic between engagement professionals and the community, but also within the community. So in Chinatown, participants talked about creating dedicated spaces to hear, particularly from women and youth, as men can be often dominant voices in shared spaces. And the third point here is considering to give greater weight to input from those who are more marginalized. So considering if you're hearing from elected officials and the public and other stakeholders, just a consideration of whether you will weight that input differently.
So Miranda, just a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
People are wondering, how do you extend these invitations? First of all, how do you find the people that you should be reaching out to? And then how would you extend these invitations to really support the pillar of equity?
That's a really good question. So I can speak from our project where it's helpful when you are familiar with the community, because then that helps you understand who the active and visible community members and leaders are. So what I was able to do was I had a chat with my executive director, came up with a number of individuals and individuals to reach out to and to invite. And then once touching base with them, I also asked for their own referrals, and it kind of cascaded from there. It is quite a bit harder if you are a bit cold to the community or you're not aware. And so I think I'll be speaking to it a little bit later, but I think that just shows the importance of familiarity. I think it's also stakeholder identification and community identification is also really important. So a lot of us, we have stakeholder identification exercises in our planning process when we design engagement programs. So it's spending adequate time to understand who the organizations are, who their staff or execs may be, and looking at the different organizations and reaching out in that way, and then starting to build some relationship with these individuals. So if you don't have pre-established relationships and awareness of the community, I would suggest putting a lot of time into stakeholder identification.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So the second pillar here, it's about cultural respect. And so the goal here is to honor and respect the community's cultural values, history, and diversity so they feel respected, included, and understood. And what was interesting about this pillar was it was formerly called cultural sensitivity, and that was scratched out very quickly by participants. Sensitivity was really a trigger word, where they said it's not about sensitivity, it's not about tolerance, it's about respect. And that's a key point that I took away from those sessions. And so what can this look like? And the first point here is learning about the community's history of exclusion. So there's so much history that explains why Chinatown is the way it is, and that's likely the same with some of the communities that you engage with as well. This comes, from the exclusionary Chinese head tax policy, which it prevented families from being united. The history of exclusion also denied Chinese people the right to vote until 1947, which is about 30 years after women had the right to vote. So just understanding what that history looks like and how this history can impact public participation and the community's trust in public processes, I'm sure it could give you a bit more of an appreciation, understanding there. As the participant said, and I quote, "Understanding the community's history is critical to working constructively." Not only do you want to learn about the history, but also learning about the community. So in Chinatown, there are very nuanced community structures and dynamics, like clans and organizations and businesses. And that really comes from understanding that history. And it's important to be aware of these, and also being aware that that you may be an outsider, and so you may not be privy to all this information. But I think it's important to be aware of that and just understanding how the dynamics of the community are. And with understanding the dynamics, it's recognizing that the community is complex. So in Chinatown, there are many tensions and alliances. There are different perspectives on projects. So for example, 105 Kiefer was very divisive, with people pro, people against. So it's not flattening the community into one bucket. It's about recognizing that there are different views and different opinions within the community. Within the complexity is also recognizing that the Chinatown community may require a different approach than, for example, a newcomer community. So it's understanding the different dynamics and the different distinguishing factors of race and class and history. And this goes without saying, but the community members were also, they wanted to make sure that we understood that putting a panda or a dragon on something does not make something culturally respectful. And that says a little bit about the presentation's name. Okay, the third pillar here is community involvement. And so we know that this is a common practice for inclusive engagement, so like having community advisory councils or committees. But we dug a bit deeper and we heard some nuances. And there are some pretty frank observations on how to meaningfully involve community in a way that doesn't tokenize. So what we want to do is create a meaningful way for the community to shape the process and the outcome so that their input feels valued and that they feel like they have an opportunity to shape the outcome of the process. And so the first piece was seeking diverse community input, and the key word here being diverse. It's important, and it was talked about many times. Community members questioned whether the liaisons and the advisors who were appointed to these community panels or advisory groups, whether they truly represented the community values and had the lived experiences of the community. So for example, does the highly educated architect who is also Chinese Canadian, do they have the same experiences? And making sure that this individual does not speak on behalf of the community. The second point here is building community capacity to engage. And this was a really interesting point for me. It's not just us parachuting in, but it's taking the time to build the capacity to ensure that they understand the project, the trade-offs, the planning and the engagement process, and doing this in an unbiased way, and giving the community time to absorb the information before having to provide input. Particularly, this is challenging because in Chinatown, there are different literacy levels, particularly among the seniors. So those quotes there, I think the term racial licensing, which is what one of our participants talked about, it's really important that community involvement, again, is not tokenizing. The fourth pillar here is on accessibility. And accessibility, again, is a really common practice when it comes to inclusive engagement. So here we dug a bit deeper to hear a bit more nuance. And what we heard was public participation doesn't often include choice, that you have to speak a certain way or you have to write in a certain way to be able to provide your input. And this is particularly difficult in Chinatown, as I mentioned, the differing literacy levels. And so it's about creating providing choice. And so our goal here is to eliminate the barriers to participation and offer different ways to seek and hear input so community members feel informed and enabled to participate in the engagement process. And the first one is investing in accessibility. So we all know this, we encounter this all the time, and this is more than picking venues that are accessible and friendly for people with different abilities. But it also looks, it's going a bit further. So one of the community members talked about translation equity, where sometimes we translate our communication materials that are going out so people can understand and they can provide input. But we often don't translate the discussion and the dialogue and the report back. And so it's a bit one-sided. So that concept of translation equity was really interesting to me. The second point is minimizing the burden to participate. So this could look like providing compensation or incentives or even mutual benefit for the community to provide their time and their input. There was also the suggestion about learning about existing processes or projects that are being led internally within the community and seeing how you can join their meetings or their events and making sure that you're not creating a parallel process. The third point here is using simple and appropriate ways to gather input. So what was interesting was at the feedback session, people actually gave us feedback that the way we were gathering input was a bit convoluted, and I really appreciated that. We were using stickers, there were different colors. Sometimes people shared that it could have been more simplified. And so some of the feedback that we got from the focus group was that appreciating that dim sum, small groups, and afternoon community sessions may be more accessible and safer than public open houses. So we use the words simple and appropriate here just to talk about the mechanisms in which you're gathering input and also the format and the venue. The fifth pillar here is trust and accountability. And again, for those of you who are in Indigenous engagement, again, this is a crucial tenet here. And we know trust is important. We know that, especially in an era where trust is degrading at a very rapid pace. So we want to dig in a bit deeper and understand a little bit of the nuance. So the community, what our goal is to demonstrate transparency, legitimacy, and credibility, so that community members feel that the engagement team is authentic and that the process is accountable. And this is a really interesting role that we play here in wanting to build and earn that trust. And so how do we do this? It's about investing time to build relationship with community members, really looking at that grounding principle that we need to change a bit of the notion of the concept of time. And part of building the relationship, what can this look like? Well, it's being aware that your tone, your approach, and your dress the messages that are coming out, it signals you as an outsider. One of the participants talked about, you don't show up in suits at a community meeting, standing with your arms crossed at the back of the room. It's just, this is what you do to build respect, is that you don't set yourself apart like that, and especially in such a visible way in power dynamic. It's also about showing your face at community events and showing that you care and that you're interested, and also sharing meals together. Anytime that you can eat with someone, it's a really great way to help build that relationship. It's also important to invest the time. So again, as I mentioned before, acknowledging that trust must be earned. So it could be appointing a project lead that may already have the trust of the community, or is a member of the community, or has trust by proxy. So similar to my situation where I had my ED vouch for me. The third point here is being open and authentic. So I definitely learned this the hard way, where it just talks about the importance of being clear about your objectives, the level of community influence you have in the final decision, who you work for, and what your goals and what your objectives and what your intentions are. An important one here is also being flexible and willing to adapt when you make mistakes, or just being willing to adapt. For example, changing the focus group design of the agenda. So I blitzed through that very quickly. Again, this is going to be sent to you afterwards, and we have the full model that's available on our website, so you can refer to it. And how did the community receive this? So at the report back meeting, we got some really good feedback. I'm not going to read this out, but I think the important points to draw from this is, all of this helps build a foundation for engaging with humility. This is a positive starting point. So again, this is, see it as a guiding model and a framework to help give you some considerations and some starting points while you're designing your engagement programs. So what can we do? What I want is that we don't go away feeling disheartened or powerless, because it's actually the opposite. I think we do have a lot of power. We do have power as engagement professionals. So I wanted to summarize some key takeaways that I want to share with you. So the last activity of the focus group was a dotocracy, where we asked 2 questions, and we gave the first question, we gave participants 3 yellow dots for the first question and 3 red dots for the second question. And the first question was, where do you think engagement teams are now putting their resources? And so this was under the structure of the pillars that we had talked about during this session. And you can see that community involvement and accessibility, or where participants thought most of the investment was going into. What was interesting was some participants didn't use all their dots because they felt like there wasn't investment going in, or they ripped their dots in half or in quarters because they didn't want to give the credit that there was actually investment going in there. The second question was, where do you think engagement teams should be putting their resources? And you can tell here, based on community input, that we are really missing the mark when it comes to trust and accountability and cultural respect. People even tore the border of the sticker around the dots to really emphasize, and that's what those plus signs are, because they really wanted to drive it home that these investments were really important. So I also have a number of takeaways and some recommendations and suggestions for you wherever you are in your journey of how you can start applying this. So the first one, we can make P2 more inclusive when we recognize and balance the power we have as engagement professionals. So it's going back to look at those grounding principles and understanding that these may be new concepts for some people, and it could be a paradigm shift, and it's taking the time to understand and explore that. And this can be facilitated through cultural safety or equity training. There are a number of equity and diversity consultants out there. I have taken an Indigenous cultural safety training course that's offered here in BC by the Provincial Health Services Authority. But please be careful about who you bring on and be critical about what their background and their approach is. It's important that they bring an anti-oppressive and decolonizing lens, because that's where you talk about the imbalance of power. What you can also do is listen, read, and watch. There are so many books and movies and podcasts and poems that are written and produced by people of color with lived experiences. So a couple of suggestions. There's a book by Ijeoma Oluo that's called So You Want to Talk About Race. There are also these fantastic podcasts, one that's done by the Globe and Mail called Color Code, another one done by NPR called Code Switch. Second takeaway here is we can make P2 more inclusive when we learn about the community's history and use this understanding to engage with cultural respect. One of the participants said, "I can't express how important it is to learn about the community's history of exclusion." And so what can we do? It's learning about the history. So I personally didn't learn about the Chinese head tax until university. So there's a lot of our colonial history in North America and potentially in Australasia as well that isn't taught in school. So it's taking the time to dig a bit deeper and find out what you don't know. It's also important to stay informed. So potentially the communities that you are trying to engage with, they're being squeezed at all sides from different issues, different policies there are a number of current issues that they're implicated in right now. And we see that across the world right now. And so it's important to understand what the community is facing historically and presently. What else can we do? You can immerse yourself. So this is, taking the ethnographic research perspective, going to community markets, going to restaurants, traveling, doing what you can to understand how and why the community's norms and their values are different from yours. The third point here is we can make P2 more inclusive when we take the time to build relationship, earn trust, and be accountable to communities. I can say that from my experience, a month after that outreach and that really challenging time of suspicion and distrust, we hugged at the report back meeting. 2 years later, when I see some community members, they ask me about my personal life and we still hug. So it's a pretty momentous occasion when you can earn trust and build that relationship. And so what can we do? I think with our position, you can pick your projects carefully if you want to build a long-term relationship with community. So taking on projects that have a reasonable budget, a reasonable timeline, because you don't want to be that person in the room who's apologizing for an engagement project that's perceived as not meaningful. You can also provide feedback to your client in saying that reaching hard to reach communities requires investment and a reasonable budget. And in falling short of that, there are risks, and being able to provide them with a risk analysis. Another thing that we can do to build relationship and earn that trust is showing up in the community. So starting to go to community events and gatherings and just showing face. I think that's important. And again, remembering to not wear a suit when you're doing that. And as I mentioned before, the importance of stakeholder identification and outreach. If you don't have a lot of time in your engagement process, one of the first things that you should do is direct outreach and introductions to community organizations and to members. Okay, the fourth point here is we can make P2 more inclusive when we advocate for dedicated resources and programs to reach those who aren't often heard. And so what can that look like? Well, you can think about submitting proposals with dedicated timing and programs to engage harder to reach communities. You can also play an advocacy role playing a bit by the books. So, for example, it's researching the demographics to help sway your client. So, for example, in Metro Vancouver, it doesn't make sense to offer everything in English because our population, it wouldn't be representative of our population. It's also important to note that the model, the tactics and the guiding strategies in there, they don't all have a cost. So again, when you're doing your stakeholder identification mapping and you're sending out those invitations, it's about being thoughtful about who you're inviting and making sure that it's representative of the different socioeconomic experiences and the different lenses that you may want to include in your engagement. An important part is also to think about trade-offs. So thinking of creative ways to do more with less. So for example, you could choose to have it in a community center rather than a hotel for a stakeholder event, and then you can use those savings to allocate towards translation. Or you could save on fancy printing and use your own printer and use the money to bring refreshments from a local community bakery. Or you can opt out of using a caterer and bring in your own food platters. So there are creative ways to help allocate resources. The fifth point here is we can make P2 more inclusive when our industry is more representative of the lived experiences and the cultural identities of the communities we engage. This is important, and it's also important to recognize that this is a systemic issue, and it speaks to an access to education and opportunities to advance. So think about this as you hire, and remember that intentional outreach might be needed, especially if your organization or your industry is quite white, and so it can be quite daunting, and I speak from experience when I say that. It's also important to hire at key levels, especially frontline levels. For example, the intercept team, or those who are doing the data analysis, or your facilitators. So really ensuring that your frontline individuals who are interacting with the community and who get to dissect and analyze and report back on what we heard, they understand the lenses and have those lived experience, so they have that nuanced understanding. I also want to flag to please not hire for tokenistic or symbolic reasons. For example, one Asian person to reach the Asian community, or one Asian person to tell you what is or isn't appropriate to reach and engage the Asian community. It's extremely, it can take a serious toll. It's emotionally draining and it's very hard. And so I really caution to please not do that. And for those of you who are racialized individuals and engagement professionals, I see you, and it is really hard and it's very difficult sometimes because it is hard work. It's difficult to engage with harder to reach communities when it becomes very personal to you. So I encourage you to have resiliency and wellness strategies, have a support system, have boundaries, and have allies on your team or in your organization who can speak out and speak up with you. I really want to end on this note that with power comes responsibility. It's on us as engagement professionals to make public participation more inclusive and equitable. I'm really happy to share this model with you. It was co-created with the Chinatown community, so know that it's available to you. And I have my email on the next slide, so if you want to update me or send me any stories of experiences you have in using different tactics in your own work, I would be very happy to hear from you. And I'd be happy to work with your team as well if you need any support in designing inclusive engagement processes with cultural communities. So thank you so much for your time. I packed a lot in, so sorry if that was really, really fast, but I really wanted to try to get as much out there.
Miranda, thank you so very much for sharing everything. I know there's more to share, and I know that you're more than welcoming in inviting people to approach you directly and learn more about what you're doing. And as you mentioned, you provided a couple of different examples of things that people could learn from. So I'm hoping that you'll send those links to Drew, and we will send them out when we send the recording and the PowerPoint and everything else, so people will have that information. But we've got quite a few questions waiting for you and a couple of comments, so give you an opportunity to breathe. And also, I really do truly want to thank you for being humble and recognizing that we all need to learn. we all need to take deep breaths and to say, don't be overwhelmed, but what can we do? How can we help? How can we listen? And people were very respectful today as they were listening to you as you were going through all of this. And now is your opportunity to share. What are your thoughts? What are your ideas? What are your questions? We've got about another 15 minutes to do that. So I'll start with the first question, and it's from Liz. When engaging in a multicultural area, do you have any advice on how to engage a diverse participant group?
How to, as in, so I understand the question as there may be people from different backgrounds in the same room. I think it's important to, this is a tough question. I would apply some of the same principles because people typically, when you have stakeholder meetings or different sessions, that they're often people with different backgrounds in the room anyway. So I think it's taking the time to understand the different backgrounds, the different perspectives, and again, through your facilitation methods, creating different ways for people to provide input, and that can look like choice. So it could be making sure that all input is not done through plenary, but potentially giving them post-it notes or other ways of writing or taking notes, or maybe having a one-on-one session with one of the staff members afterwards. So if you see, if you're scanning the room and you see that there are different varying levels of engagement and someone is sitting back, but you know that they have something to share, it may be a follow-up afterwards, not in front of everyone, but really catering to what the different needs are, understanding that you do have, you know, a diverse group. Mm-hmm. That would be my suggestion.
Yeah, and certainly knowing who's in the room and giving people the opportunity to listen and learn from each other, because they're probably coming at your project from slightly different perspectives. So opening it up, encouraging, celebrating the different diversity that's within the room, I think is great. And also absolutely providing all of those different ways to become engaged, become informed. Thank you for that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So Julie was asking, how long was the engagement process in total?
Thanks for your question, Julie. So we started planning at the end, or about mid-June, and then we had both focus groups in July, and then we had a report back meeting near the end of August. So it was quite accelerated.
Thank you. So a couple of comments now from Kobe. Ooh. I'm glad you spoke about racial license, which is a new term for me, but a practice I regularly observe and experience. Oftentimes, engagement by majority communities is conducted through proxies, even though the proxies aren't the ones who need to establish the relationships. And I think that's more of a comment. Certainly, I think we have lots of practitioners on the line today, so others may feel that way. But any thoughts on Kobe's comment, Miranda?
I found the concept of racial licensing really interesting, and that came from actually experiences and observations of watching only certain individuals representing and speaking on behalf of the community during the 105 Kiefer process. So I think that was quite a topical conversation. And I think if the individual or the representative does have the community trust and does share the values and can speak on behalf of the community from an informed and trusted place, I think that's positive, and that's a bit of a different situation than what these individuals were or what these participants were talking about, where it was a bit of, I don't understand why this person who doesn't quite live in Vancouver, who doesn't quite set foot in Vancouver's Chinatown that often, why they may be speaking on behalf of the community. Only because they're Chinese.
Thank you for that. Mm-hmm. So this is a long one from Kyle. Trust and accountability is important and is often directly linked to the process of decision-making, which engagement contributes to. Are there aspects of this framework that you find particularly valuable in reflecting back to your clients? For example, we can make many changes and improvements to our engagement process for inclusivity, but what is your advice on how we can support our decision-maker clients to incorporate their ideas into how they make decisions. So interesting. So we work very hard with the process with our participants, but how do we work with our decision makers to really reflect what we're hearing and the decisions that are coming forward from our participants?
That's a great question, Kyle. Thank you for that. What we like to do is almost play by the rules and work within the system. So that looks like, we would conduct the demographic research to understand that the communities that you're seeking the input from to influence the decision, that it looks quite varied. And then we also know, based on our engagement expertise, that it requires specialized tactics and allocated budget and time in order to reach them in a meaningful way and to gather their input. And that might be done through, if you are working with the decision maker, the client, or the elected official, being able to provide a bit of a risk analysis that it's really important that we do this because falling short could hurt the credibility of the decision. And what we also do in our What We Heard reports is we report back on the composition of the participants who had their say. So we include demographic questions on the different factors that are important to the process. So it could be user background, or cultural background, or age, or where you live, different kinds of demographic factors, and reporting back on the representativeness of the input that influences a decision. I think we tell our client that we report back on it because more representation helps to strengthen the decision-making process. And so that's what we do. That's a bit of not the game we play, but that's the system we work with in order to help decision makers allocate more money and understand the importance of representative input. Does that answer the question?
Well, I'll wait for Kyle to respond, but I have to say that you've got about 6 or 7 more questions, so I'm going to keep going, and if Kyle wants to respond, he's more than welcome. So from Kim, which tools did you use to evaluate the success of the engagement?
That's a great question, Kim. So evaluate the success of the engagement, particularly with this Chinatown study. We didn't have any formal performance metrics. We didn't have an evaluation survey at the end, but I can tell you that getting hugs and having personal dialogue and conversations with community members a couple months, a couple years after the touch point, I think was really important and is indicative of something that we built and that we took the time to earn. So while there was nothing formal, I think that was pretty indicative. We also had a number of comments regarding feedback. One of the slides talked about that, and we did hear that this model is positive. It captured what I shared. It's really hard to put into words everything that we talked about, but this model captures a lot of it. So we did hear some positive feedback in that regard.
Thanks very much. And so, to be honest, I would encourage anyone, if you take any of the information that Miranda has provided to you today and you actually try out the model, please share that with Miranda, because I'm sure you'd love to hear how well it works with other communities and other places and other cities. It's a very sound model, and it would be nice to see how it can be used in different communities. So I hope that's okay that I put out that request, Miranda, but I'm
Absolutely.
sure you'd like to hear how it works elsewhere.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So from Debbie, you talked about defining inclusivity. What are some tactics you use to help bring those answers forward?
Can you repeat that question again?
Absolutely. You talked about defining inclusivity. What are some tactics you use to help bring those answers forward?
In terms of facilitation tactics, I think the greatest tactic was taking the time at the beginning to learn more about each other and clearing the air and really putting everything on the table. So it was that 45 minutes of introductions and having a frank Q&A that really set us up to have a conversation about defining inclusivity. And it really was a plenary discussion. So it wasn't highly facilitated. It was, I put the question up on the slide and we just had a conversation. Community members built on each other's answers and I just scribbled furiously. So there really wasn't any fancy techniques there, but it really could not have happened without giving that space at the front.
Thanks, Miranda. So from Robert, public participation often becomes a process of engage everyone all the time on everything, and then we can totally ignore their input. This can burn the community out. How to know what are the appropriate issues to engage the community on the relevant issues? So it's probably for all of us to think about, because I think we all face that, like, how many times are we out in the community? How many, because public participation has become a little bit of a buzzword. We need to be out there. We need to be doing this. Are we engaging people? Are we doing all of that? And Robert's right. Sometimes we don't do it well and we do burn people out. So any thoughts?
I think engagement fatigue is real, and I think you're totally right. I think it's offering the opportunity to be involved. I think even though people are burnt out, what I heard from participants was everyone was quite burnt out. They were very worn, but they said they need to keep on taking the opportunity. They need to keep on going to the public hearings and having their say, because who else will to save their community and to preserve their community? So I think doing what you can to see where you can condense or group your engagement processes, maybe so you go out a bit less, or you're careful about the timing of concurrent engagement processes. So you're not piecemeal engaging on one go and trying to be really intentional about it. Because I think you're right. I think the burnout and fatigue is real. Something else that we heard, again, was talking about that reducing and eliminating some of the barriers to participate. So that could look like compensation. That could look like having a meal at your community advisory panel meeting. A bit softening the amount of effort it takes for community members to have their say each time. So those are a couple ideas there.
Thank you. So from Bajinka, in a culturally diverse community meeting with different cultural groups, would you suggest breaking into groups for small discussions, not by where people are sitting or letting people self-select they would like to join?
That's a really interesting question, Bajinka. Thank you for that. I do not think... Ideally, I would spend a bit of time with your questions before responding to them on the spot, but I think my immediate response would be I wouldn't segregate it and I wouldn't parse everybody out. I think I would keep it in a group where I would break out the breakout groups in a non-culturally specific way, because what's interesting and what we're trying to learn from this model and testing it is that there's some similarities across communities, especially factors of history of exclusion, race and class, ethnic enclaves and gentrification in some of these ethnic enclaves and these areas. So I think the beauty of having these community sessions where everybody's together with different perspectives is that there's some commonalities, and then you're helping to build some of those community relationships within. So I personally wouldn't, but I'm sure other people may have experiences with that and they can share theirs.
Thanks, Miranda. So Kyle just wanted to let you know he's good. So he did get back to us. So you're golden on that one. And from Camden, one Department of Transportation appointed a, in quotes, tribal liaison, and she is terrible at her job. We had a project in an area with substantial First Nation population, and all of the outreach to these groups was removed from our outreach plan and given to the tribal liaison. The result was one email sent to a few First Nation leaders 1 week before the meeting. It looked really bad, and we had nearly zero participation from First Nation people. Any suggestions for bureaucratic workaround?
Whew. Tribal liaison. I have never heard it referred to in that way. I think that's, I wouldn't call it that. I'm sorry to hear about your experience. This study was looking at cultural communities. I think when you're talking about Indigenous communities and engaging with Indigenous communities, there is so much to learn. And so I don't want to pretend that this model incorporates or includes Indigenous communities by any means. I think one email as an invitation is absolutely a shortcoming. And so I would really emphasize the grounding principles as well as that trust and accountability part of the model. I think if you wanted to play in the bureaucratic realm, again, talking about some of that risk analysis, I think it's quite obvious if you look from a resource perspective that you had an engagement program and very few or one individual showed up, which really discredits and reduces some of that credibility of the decision and the engagement process. So if you incorporate that into risk analysis and how that's not very good value for money, I would say that's a bit more bureaucratic speak of being able to chat with some of the government folks about why just a better approach is needed. There is so much more that I can say for this response, but because your question was looking at how we can talk about this with government officials, I think those are some of the tactics that you could use. But I do think there's a good level of education and understanding and Indigenous cultural competency that is involved for any kind of outreach and engagement and relationship building with Indigenous communities. And I'm hoping that if the tribal liaison that you are working with, if they are falling short, I hope something can be rectified very quickly.
Thanks, Miranda. So you've got a lot of other comments that would thank you and great presentation, but I'm going to give you a chance to breathe for just for about a minute while I talk about what's coming up next month, and then I'll give you an opportunity for any last words. So coming up next month is the last of our Victoria Encore series, session presentations from the 2018 IAP2 North American Conference that attendees told us would make a good webinar. Navigating the culture wars through thoughtful P2 is a look at human behavior, the battle for control and toxic participants, and how we approach these issues as P2 practitioners. It's never been easy, but to be successful these days, we need to adjust to a hyper-political and partisan environment. This session will explore the key battles we face in designing and conducting successful participation. We'll discuss creating a level playing field, creating trust, and facilitating success. What are the obstacles? That's coming up Tuesday, August 13th at 11 a.m. Pacific Time, 2 Eastern, and anyone can register with their IAP2 affiliate. So we encourage you to do that. And we also want to sincerely thank Miranda for joining us today. And of course, we want to remind you to come to the IAP2 North American Conference in Charlotte, North Carolina. It's happening September 4th to September 6th. And this is where a lot of these webinars originate from people that have come in, they've participated in these conference sessions, and they've said, other people need to hear this. Other people need to be able to learn what I've just learned and listen to. So Miranda, any last thoughts before we sign off?
I just want to quickly say a huge thank you to everyone who tuned in. And the presentation, it was quick, it was fast, it was a bit dense. But thank you for the really thoughtful questions and the comments. I hope that all of you take something away and have something that you can do within your power to be able to help change the way that we can engage with marginalized and communities of color in a more meaningful way. I also really want to thank Amelia and Drew for having me back here and for giving me the opportunity to talk about this. It's a really important topic, and I think I really encourage everyone to continue along their journeys about understanding race equity and race issues.
So thank you very much, Miranda. Thank you again for sharing your knowledge. And thank you to everyone for participating. I know there was a couple of questions that I didn't get to, but I would absolutely encourage you to approach Miranda directly. And Tim, we saw your question about Indigenous. We did have an Indigenous taster series back in, I believe, February. So we'll try and make sure that we send you a link to that presentation as well. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I hope that everyone has a wonderful summer. Get out and enjoy. And we look forward to talking to you again in August. Take care. Bye-bye now.